Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Ellen Lupton. I'm Senior Curator of Contemporary Design here at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, and we are so happy to welcome you. We have been closed. Now we are open. We have brand new exhibitions for you to see and amazing programs. Check our website every week. We have just amazing things happening, and I'm so glad to share with you tonight what we're doing. I curated an exhibition upstairs called Beautiful Users, which introduces the public to the idea of design as a human-centered activity. And we look at a range of projects and how designers have transformed from looking at an ideal or normative user to a more inclusive and individual approach to who it is that uses the stuff that designers make. So tonight we're going to talk about universal design, and what I'm going to do is briefly introduce our panelists, and I'm going to turn it over then to Amy Hamray, who will be our moderator tonight. So, Amy Hamray is Assistant Professor of Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University, where they study the intersections of design, disability, and knowledge production. Their current book project, Building Access, Universal Design, Technoscience, and the Politics of Knowledge, studies the history of universal design in the US through the lenses of feminist disability theories and philosophies of technology. So cool. Amy works in the interdisciplinary fields of disability studies, feminist science studies, and the history and philosophy of science and technology. Wow. So great. Amy is going to start our event with an overview of universal design, looking at where it came from and how the conversation is changing today. And then each of our panelists will come up and talk for 10 minutes about what they're doing in this field, new stuff happening in this field. So the first of those panelists is John Marshall. He is co-founder and design director at MAP, a London-based creative consultancy whose clients include some of the most innovative companies in the world, including Virgin Atlantic, Google, and Panasonic. John graduated from the Royal College of Art in 1996 and then worked at leading design firms Pentagram and Ross Lovegrove. He joined Barber Osgerby as studio director in 2003, and he co-founded MAP in 2012. And his work with is included in Beautiful Users. In fact, all of our panelists have projects on view upstairs. Gianfranco Zakai is president and chief design officer of Continuum, the global design innovation consultancy behind some products you may have heard of, like the Reebok pump and P&G's Swiffer. Continuum has worked with Herman Miller Company to develop new patient care rooms, exam rooms, and the Nala patient chair. The Metaform transgenerational personal hygiene system, which has been featured here at Cooper Hewitt and other places, facilitates independence for people with disabilities and their extended families. Ree Norregard recently became director at Quirky, a community-powered innovation company. Previously, Ree launched Omhu, a boutique designer and manufacturer of award-winning mobility products. She also served as creative director at Frog, Organic, Arnell Group, and Smart Design in New York City. And finally, Scott Summit founded Bespoke Innovations in 2010 based on 20 years of experience and research in design and additive fabrication, which you may also call 3D printing. Bespoke believes that an integrated approach connecting design, medicine, and technology stands to offer meaningful and, above all, individualized solutions to address a wide variety of human needs. Bespoke was acquired by 3D Systems in May of 2012, and Summit now leads the company's industrial design efforts. And he has many products on view here at Cooper Hewitt right now, as do all of you great designers. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass the event on to Amy to get things started.
How's my volume? Good? Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Ellen and the Cooper Hewitt for organizing this amazing panel. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the history of universal design in the United States today. Universal design is typically something that we talk about as the idea that buildings and products should be accessible by design for as many people as possible. I won't be talking today about any specific examples of objects or spaces. If you would like to see some of them, there are many in this museum. There's also very good historical work that you can read about this. What I'm going to talk about instead is the concept of universal design, the methods that come out of it, and communities of practice that have formed around it. So groups of people who, over a period of time, came together to kind of come up with this idea and to innovate it. It's especially exciting that this is happening here at the Cooper Hewitt because this has really been a place that has driven the concept and theory of universal design in very interesting and innovative ways, primarily under the leadership of a previous director, Diane Pilgrim, who did a lot of work both to make the museum building itself accessible and to deepen the collections to include more objects in kind of human-centered design, the types of objects that you would see upstairs in the beautiful users exhibit, which I hope that everyone will go to. In 1998, this museum actually had the first exhibit of universal design products and was kind of part of asking questions about what universal design should mean moving forward. And so what I'm going to do is kind of go backwards in history, tell you a little bit about how we got to 1998, and then talk about kind of where we can go from here. One other thing I want to mention really briefly is that the Smithsonian Institution itself, of which this museum is a part, is a federal institution that has been bound by disability access laws since the late 1960s. And because of that, it has actually innovated the movement towards universal design in really significant ways because it has so many museums and so many visitors. And so beginning in the 1990s, the Smithsonian actually worked to implement universal design principles into a kind of set of guidelines for all of its museums, and I think there are like 15 or 18 museums maybe. And so this place is kind of part of the largest network of places where you can actually observe and interact with universal design features, and you probably wouldn't know that they're there because they're all built in. The people who were in charge of that, Jan Majewski and Beth Zebarth, are people who have run the accessibility office and have done a lot of work in this. And I just want to read something from a letter in 1993 that Jan Majewski wrote to David McFadden, who was then at the Cooper Hewitt as a curator. And he was the one who was helping to curate the Unlimited by Design exhibit that came up in '98. She wrote, "I think that two important points to convey in the Smithsonian Access Guidelines are that accessible universal design is not inherently ugly, and that people with disabilities should be first, not last, in the audiences that designers consider when designing environments, programs, and publications. If it works for people with disabilities, it'll work for many others, but the reverse is not always true. It might also be interesting to look at instances of design developed for people with disabilities becoming design for everyone." And the reason I read this is that I think it really reveals a lot of the experimentation around the concept of universal design that has taken place in our very recent history, that this isn't always a stable concept. It's always changing, and it includes a lot of different components. And so I'll talk about what some of those are and where they've come from. The first time the term universal design appeared in print was in 1985 when the disabled North Carolinian architect and industrial designer Ron Mace wrote an article entitled Universal Design, Barrier-Free Environments for Everyone, in which he argued that design should keep all users in mind, not just the average and not just users that are labeled as exceptional. And so the ideas that came out of this were, one, that design should have multiple use, that there should be multiple users for an object or a space, but also that things should be flexible and be able to be used in different ways, that these designs should be have access built into them rather than needing changes later, and that this has added value kind of for everyone who's involved. But words like universal design and phrases like all users or everyone should also give us a little bit of pause, because so often these ways of talking about users actually flatten the differences between them instead of appreciating the differences that are significant or that would require different access needs. There's actually nothing about terms like universal or all users that ensures that designers will remain accountable to disabled users. And there's also nothing in these terms that recognizes the political demands of marginalized users and the way that marginalized users, such as disabled people, have contributed to the history of design, particularly in the case of universal design. So why do we even use these terms? This is something that people have asked pretty much during the entire history of universal design, and other terms have been proposed, such as design for all or transgenerational design, design for aging. But the reason why we use these terms and why the word universal is in the title is because disabled people have been denied access to membership in the universal historically. And because these terms have been ways that designers and advocates have talked about the relationship between disability and design for decades. Since after World War II, when there was kind of an influx of a lot of disabled veterans into US society, as well as moving out of institutions and nursing homes by civilians with disabilities, since that time, designers have been thinking about users, whether average or non-average, in different ways. In the late 40s, there were actually two competing paradigms for what today we call user-centered design. The first was taking place within industrial design, and you can see a lot of examples of this in Beautiful Users, actually. The industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss came up with the idea of human engineering, or what now we might call ergonomics. But it was frequently for the average person. And he saw human variation as a resource for design, but didn't really have a consciousness about disability. And so disability was entering into design elsewhere. In architecture, of all places, there was a movement towards barrier-free design, which was the idea of removing architectural barriers for disabled people and desegregating society to undo the work of institutionalization and things like that. And barrier-free design actually saw disability as a resource for design rather than a deficit. And it saw disabled people as resourceful designers themselves. And so there are a lot of examples, and the historian Bess Williamson has written about this, examples in the 1940s and 50s of, for instance, people with polio who do these kinds of like DIY hacks in their houses or invent different technologies themselves, and their resourcefulness as part of this process of removing barriers in society. It's actually ironic that these parallel tracks are happening at the same time, because today it is industrial design that pays a lot more attention to disability, and in architecture, disability tends to kind of still be marginalized and associated with kind of minimum standards and legal codes. Some of the things that took place in the early days of barrier-free design, and these are really old scans of very old pictures, so I'll try to describe what's happening in them. Different kinds of wheelchair ramps, hydraulic lifts for public transportation. These are images from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, which was one of the first accessible campuses in the United States, beginning in the late 1940s and into the 50s and 60s. There's still a program there. And in barrier-free design, as you can see in these pictures, buildings and products were integrated. So architecture and product design had to happen together because you needed access in both for it to be meaningful. And from the beginning, the emphasis was that this was beneficial for all users, not just disabled users. And so part of the research that went into the first barrier-free design standards actually reported that at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, they had developed these shower seats for people to use, for instance, like for a wheelchair user to transfer into the shower. And they were made of really good materials, but they broke very quickly. And when they investigated to see why they were breaking quickly, they found out that all of the non-disabled students were using these shower seats too. And so it was exceeding the kind of amount of use that was necessary. And so from that, they gleaned that many of these technologies actually are beneficial to a wider user base. The language of kind of all users appears again in 1967 when the Rehabilitation Services Administration wrote a report in support of a bill that came to be known as the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. It was the first law that said that public buildings, like federal buildings, had to be accessible. And this report, which was called Design for All Americans, made the argument that disabled and elderly people were citizens, and so they deserved access to desegregated spaces. What was interesting about this, though, is that even though it was happening at the height of the civil rights movement, there was really no consideration of racial integration in a lot of these laws. And so even the way that the user was constructed in barrier-free design was very white. And it was not until much later that, for instance, the Federal Housing Act was amended to include disability to look at some of those intersections between racial segregation and disability segregation. The Architectural Barriers Act was poorly enforced, and so was another law, Section 504 of the Federal Rehabilitation Act, which would have made the bill enforceable. And so disability activists famously protested. They conducted some of the longest sit-ins in US history and forced the federal government to enforce these laws. This is a sit-in in Washington, D.C. There were also ones in San Francisco. And while they were waiting for those laws to be enforced, what they did was they invented curb cuts. And this is a kind of a really good example of the kind of resourcefulness and ingenuity of disabled people as designers. Curb cuts are the technology that we most commonly use to talk about universal design. And the idea is that wheelchair users can use them, bicyclists, people pushing strollers, and people walking, and people getting around in all sorts of other ways. But where these come from, and there's kind of like a lot of lore about this in disability rights movement history. The lore is that disabled people would go out under dark of night with sledgehammers and bust up the sidewalks and pour cement curb cuts in their place just so that they could get around. And so there's actually a piece of one of these curb cuts from a Denver ADAPT protest from 1978 in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., which is what I'm showing here. And there are also examples of this that happened in Berkeley and in other places. So you kind of get a sense of this like social movement activity towards barrier-free design and the idea that people were innovating different ways of having built environments so that everyone could use them. In the 1980s, the design profession started to kind of catch up with all of this. And there were specific organizations that we're kind of integrating more of a disability consciousness. The Industrial Design Society of America, the Environmental Design Research Association, as well as design schools began teaching about disability. So people like Elaine Ostroff in Boston, Ray Lifshay in San Francisco at the University of California, Berkeley, began to kind of look to what they called user experts, or the idea that disabled users could also be experts in the design process. And then communities of practice began to form around what would later be called universal design. And these were necessarily interdisciplinary communities, and they were kind of united around a shared investment in disability access, but bringing different perspectives together. And so in 1982, there was a conference called Designed Environments for All People that happened actually in New York City. And this was where Ronald Mace got the idea for universal design. And it was partially through talking to all these people. And I'm about to list some people who may or may not mean anything to some of you, but I'll just tell you. So the disabled politician Max Cleland, before he was a senator. Hale Zukis, who was a leader of the independent living movement in Berkeley and allegedly one of the curb cut smashers. Victor Papanek, just as he was finishing his book, Design for the Human Scale. Architects Lawrence Halprin, Charles Moore, and Stanley Tigerman. Barrier-free design experts, I already mentioned Ron Mace. Also other people you may have heard of, John Salmon, Gunnar Dibwad, James Bostrom, Polly Welch, Ray Lifshay, and Patricia Moore. And then some social scientists who are kind of leaders in this field of accessibility today, Gary Moore, John Zeisel, and Craig Zimring. So this was 1982. It was kind of like a meeting of the minds. All these people got together and said, you know, how can we actually make barrier-free design kind of successful in the built environment? And this is reportedly where Mace came up with his idea, which he wrote about in 1985. So fast forward a few years to 1990, this is when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And this was landmark legislation, civil rights legislation. But one of the things that it did was that it made barrier-free design basically synonymous with meeting kind of minimal code standards. And people started to use other language to talk about what barrier-free design had meant for, you know, the 40 years up until then. And the language that they sometimes used for that was universal design. Sometimes universal design also meant anything that was outside of the law. Sometimes it meant anything that had built-in accessibility. Sometimes it meant design for aging. That's still a really common thing. And very frequently, it meant any kind of design that had nothing to do with disability at all, which is really strange and unfortunate. And the argument was that disability design was either what you enforced through a code or something that was inherently about quote unquote special needs. And that universal design was about good design for everyone. I think that this was kind of where things started to get a little weird because what that definition encouraged was this idea of disability as a hindrance to design rather than a resource. And so disability kind of became a liability for marketing or for what could be counted as good design. And that's still a really dominant conception of universal design today that I think is very problematic and that I think that we should kind of, I do my historical work to show why this is not the case, because I think that it's more important to think about disability as a resource and to remember the history of disabled designers and activists who contributed to this idea. So between 95 and 97, a group of designers and experts came up with the 7 principles of universal design to kind of remedy some of this problem with not everyone really knowing what universal design meant or agreeing. And what they did was they sort of combined all of these ideas. So they emphasized equity and flexibility, which are kind of more disability inclusive. They also talked about things like tolerance for error, allowing multiple mediums and sources of information, and providing adequate space for users to interact, which are kind of things that come from more the industrial design or human factors side. And this is basically the most often cited document in universal design, and it's been contested a lot, but it's pretty much the one that everyone always talks about. And what it did was it turned universal design into a process and a methodology rather than a single unified concept by recognizing that it was not a unified concept. And so that is kind of like the dominant paradigm of universal design. And I'll just show one last thing, which is where I think universal design is going in some ways, and what it should be doing kind of going forward. This is a picture from the Blouson Spinal Cord Center in Vancouver, BC, which is a completely universally designed building down to every feature, but its primary aesthetic and functional feature is this ramp that goes to every floor of the building, and it's decorated and it's in a glass atrium, and it kind of proclaims the existence of disability and celebrates it as a resource in the design of the building itself, rather than trying to hide it and trying to distance the concept from disability. So I'll just leave that there for us to think about, and we'll have our other speakers now. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. So my name's John Marshall. I'm director of a design studio in London called MAP. And we're in Shoreditch, which is the east part of London. And we do industrial design with a, I think, user-centered approach based on a lot of research and strategy. And there's something quite unique about our studio. We're part of a group that includes Barbara Oscarby, which is a furniture studio, and also Universal Design Studio, which is an architecture practice, and the name is really, really confusing in the context of today's event. Formed over 10 years ago, before the term was widely used in the UK at least. And so what I really love about being in this studio with all these different scales of things going on at the same time is the kind of focus on a user or people. So you have furniture designers working alongside product designers, where product designers are pushing millimeters around on products that you hold in your hand. Next to them, you've got architects with big chunks of material, thinking about environments which you pass through. And I think this kind of cross-pollination between the different scales of product design, furniture design, and architecture is something that I find very exciting about our studio and very interesting, and brings us all the time back to the user. So the sort of projects that we do at MAP, things like a meal tray for Virgin Atlantic that was a better experience for the passenger, but also was lightweight and therefore saved energy. An exhibition for Google, which was about the power of the internet. So we created some experiments which enabled people to interact with objects in the museum, but also online over the internet. So a musical instrument you could play, or a robot which could draw your face in sand, and there's actually one of these robots here in the museum. We also work with a lot of technology companies, so for instance working with Yamaha on flexible speaker technology. And also we've done quite a number of projects with Panasonic, and Panasonic have a very multi-generational approach to design. A good example is this induction hob, which in order to kind of communicate the new technology of induction cooking, uses these lights which are just around the area where the pans are put, and that sort of is symbolic of the flame on a gas hob. And so that's a really good communication method to get across a kind of a new technology. The process we use, as I said, I think it's very user-focused, and there are sort of 4 pillars to it, in my opinion. First of all, research. So we like our designers to go out and do the research, and largely speaking, that means going into people's homes and talking to people about the products they use. The second thing is that before we start design, we actually build stories or strategies which articulate in written form what we intend to do and what a measure of success would be. And sort of true to the stereotype, it involves a lot of post-it notes. The third thing is that we, although we're a consultancy, we tend to co-create most of our work with our clients in the room together, so there's a lot of meetings and workshops. And the fourth thing is that we're always prototyping and making models of our work, and we use those to test the design with users as part of the process. So I've actually picked out 2 projects which I think are good examples of that process I've just articulated. And also I think there are elements of universal design in both of them. The first one is the Kano computer kit. So this is a computer kit aimed at kids, and you can build a computer and then learn to code using this kit. So the process was very much as I described earlier. So there's a lot of meetings with the client, and this was a startup, so we were actually starting from scratch, really. And we also spent a lot of time observing the target group, who were kids in this case. And we also tried in this instance to combine together the product design and the packaging as a single unified experience. So we're using models and mock-ups to try to refine the design and test those with the user. So a couple of things that I think came out of it that were quite interesting, or insights that were interesting. One was when we were watching the kids play with the kit, we noticed how much they used colour to organise what they were doing. So in the final design, we used a lot of coloured cables, and we kind of codified what the cables did. And that runs right through the product and the packaging, and also into the instructions. And the second thing is that it was really interesting watching kids as young as 6 using a trackpad. So they didn't seem to be able to do click and drag, which I don't know if you're familiar with using a trackpad, but it's something you use a lot to sort of drag and drop things in a computer environment. And so, since kids were not able to do that, we actually designed the keyboard with these separate, these 2 grey buttons on the bottom left, separate left and right mouse buttons. So that enabled kids really young, even those without much dexterity, to manipulate things on the computer. So I think those kind of points on this project were quite interesting for us, and they are, I think, quite universal design processes. The second project I want to talk about, and Ellen mentioned there's some pieces from this in the exhibition here, is Sabi Space. So Sabi is actually an interesting brand set up by a guy called Asaf Wand about 3 years ago, specifically to target baby boomers. And the first range that was created were these really sort of super slick pill organizers. So we were approached to do a follow-up range, which is called Sabi Space. And really the only restriction on us, or the only brief, was to do something that still appealed to this core demographic of baby boomers, but was just for the home, anywhere in the home. And we have quite a young team at MAP, so one of the first things we did is we kind of dug into all the available desk research on baby boomers and tried to kind of understand what the issues were for this target group. We also did a lot of workshops with the client, and we also spoke to a lot of experts in this field. And we sort of, what we arrived at was an idea around agility. So the things that seemed to be issues were around reaching, eyesight, and memory. So like a typical product that we thought we might design would be a sort of a reaching stick to help grab things from a high bookshelf. When we went out and actually spoke to the users as part of our home visit research, we found that they didn't really like that idea. Emotional connection with these agility enhancers like these reaching sticks. And instead what we found is that these baby boomers, they just thought they were young, so they didn't really realize they were aging. And why not? So we just thought however well we can design something, a kind of agility enhancer, they weren't going to buy it. So instead, the themes that came up were around organization, neatness, solving simple problems, and very much in the bathroom, actually. So we refocused our attention onto the bathroom, and we took these 3 sort of key ideas. One was to design things that were not stigmatizing, so it didn't look like they were for aging people. The second one was to empower people to use products to change simple things in their daily life. And the third one was just around quick fixes, simple things. So there's kind of no better quick fix than sticky tape. And actually the range that we came up with is all based on this 3M tape, which is on a little peg that you can stick onto the wall. And then you can use that to put on the wall really quickly in any room, but primarily in the bathroom, a range of functional devices. So things that are quite decorative in a way, like a rail for a hook rail, or things that are about self, so mirrors, things that are about organization, like a shower caddy, and some things that were more about function, for instance, moving a toilet paper holder, if it's in the wrong position and you have to twist around, is really hard in a bathroom with a tiled wall. But with this adhesive pad, it can be done really easily. So the range looks really nice and kind of universal and appeals to old and young alike. But one of the things we wanted to do is include at least one of these agility enhancer type products in the range. So this round kind of halo-like blue thing that's on the wall is actually, it's a grab rail to help people get in and out of the bath. So one thing we noticed with bathroom is that a lot of accidents happen when people step in and out of the bath. And we wanted to solve that as well as solving all the other things that I mentioned. So we were searching for a kind of format that was non-stigmatizing, but also worked really well for its core functionality of being able to grab or lean on. And we did that through a range of models, foam models, and just testing them using video to kind of communicate this back to the client. The one that we sort of went with in the end was the round shape, and it was mostly because it offers different ways to grab around it. So if you're a couple, one's tall and one's short, you can grab it in two different places. And also the curved shape itself is quite easy to grab if you have arthritis. So partly this was done through testing and partly it was done through discussion with experts. And I think above all, it meets this sort of no stigma approach that we wanted. So you can throw a towel on it and it doesn't really look like a grab rail. So one final thing I just wanted to mention, and it's a kind of personal passion of mine, is about how packaging can significantly improve products. So you can design a great product, but if you can't get into the packaging, it's massively frustrating. So on this range in particular, we took care with the packaging to create very clear, simple packaging that was easy to open. And we even added things like a template to help you put it on the wall with a little spirit level to make sure you got those beautiful hanging rails straight. And we also took a lot of care on the instructions. So instructions for products typically are not done by the core design team, but in this case, we brought them into our scope and took a lot of care to make sure that they were very clear. So that's the Sabi Space range. I think just as a final note, with those two projects, which are for growth companies, universal design is not only good for the user, but I think for our clients, it's a kind of a business imperative. So, and with that, I'll hand over to Gianfranco.
Thank you. Nice work. Well, thank you very much. So I took the theme very literally about whether it's myth or reality. And I really think that it's a little bit of both, right? That it's really about design for all, and all is a very broad distribution of people. And in some cases, we make things better for many more people. And in some cases, making things better for more people creates problems for others. A friend of mine, Jane Thompson, once said, I love the quote her, she said that most problems are caused by solutions. And I remember meeting an individual who was part of the drafting of the Americans with Disabilities Aid, who is blind. And he mentioned that curb cuts actually created a problem for blind people because they can't detect where the sidewalk ends and the street begins. Of course, that's been taken care of with some, textures and so forth that allows people to understand that transition. But I think there are a lot of, it's a very broad brush that we talk about when we talk about design for a universal design, right? And there are many kinds of disabilities. There are physical disabilities, there are intellectual disabilities, right? And in some ways, there are also cultural and racial disabilities because we create them. So I think that the idea of looking at areas of common desires for mobility, for example, among a very broad and diverse group of people is absolutely valid. But I think it's also important to think about designing for one, right? Because the needs of people at the extreme ends of the ability spectrum are very, very different. So I think we have to be nuanced in what we do. Now, I think designing things that are easier for all just makes sense, right? And a number of years ago, it's now 16 or 17 years ago, we came up with the Swiffer for Procter & Gamble. So that's just about cleaning, right? And we realized that using a lot of water and detergent to clean a floor, it was both messy and unproductive because most of what's on the floor is dust, and the best way to pick it up is with static electricity and a simple disposable piece of paper. And that's easier for everybody. And when the product was introduced, my sister, who had a small grandchild at the time, was delighted because her grandchild started cleaning the floor for her because it was kind of fun, right? So doing things that are non-stigmatizing and fun actually is a really good objective. Removing barriers is also a good objective. So 27 years ago, we started on a project for Herman Miller called Metaform. And part of that, and Metaform for us was all about personal hygiene, how people can be independent in their own homes, and personal hygiene becomes really important. And that's really where we learned what the previous speaker spoke about, the importance of not stigmatizing people, because we were looking at a broad range of older users. And we realized that even though they needed help, many of the tools that were available, like grab bars and so forth, were not present in their bathrooms, right? And my own father at the time was aging, and his ability was decreasing rapidly. And he didn't want to hear about any of that, right? But he would love to go to a supermarket and push a shopping cart around because there was no stigma to that, right? Never would use a walker, however. So anyway, so we designed a number of components to a bathroom, including this barrier-free drain that would remove water without requiring any kind of a curb, and where the covers could go into the dishwasher because that would be easier to maintain. But we also wanted to think about mass optimization, right? Because we have the technology allows us to do things that can adjust themselves for individual needs. And that also allows us to overcome some of the stigma issues, because we're thinking about, older people with grandchildren, right? Why should we stigmatize either one of those? So as part of Metaform, we designed things like these modules that would fit into a wall, and where, for example, a sink with storage, lighting, mirrors would all adjust at the touch of a button, or better yet, would adjust because a ceiling as you entered the room measured you, and everything would appear at the proper height. And a toilet that would also adjust to different heights. And why is that important? Well, because we're really designed as human beings to go in the bushes and squat. And when we do that, it requires less effort. But it's not very decorous, right? And most Westerners are not comfortable doing that, right? But also we have a problem because men miss the mark. So you'd like to have a toilet much higher for certain functions, right? And children who are just learning to potty train would like to have a toilet that's much lower so they don't have to fear falling in. So we designed this toilet that would rotate into the wall where be cleaned, because nobody likes to clean the toilet. But you could sit on it at any height. You could transfer from a wheelchair. You could sit at a very high height and ride it down to a semi-squat position to facilitate elimination. But we also realized as we develop more solutions that sometimes solutions that disappear are the very best, because there's stigma even in overcoming diseases like diabetes. So this is a wearable, disposable insulin pump, which was developed about 7 or 8 years ago for a startup company in Massachusetts. And the whole idea was to be able to dispense insulin over a constant period, controllable based on someone's activity and what they've eaten with a remote controller. So you clean a part on the body and apply the pump, and then it automatically inserts a cannula and then dispenses insulin over a 3-day period. And the great thing about this was that up until this time, a lot of type 1 diabetics that tend to be children would not be using insulin pumps. And the reason using it was thought to be because they would often have infections because of the exterior lines would get snagged as they play, and the area would get dirty and an infection would ensue. But we really thought that that was only part of the problem. Part of the problem, yes, children want to play, but they also want to look just like other children. So they don't want to be stigmatized. So the idea of a pump that you could wear under your clothes, you could wear when you're sleeping, and it would just go away, seemed like a natural and very desirable solution. So this product was developed. We developed it over a 2 or 3 year period. In 3 years, it gotten FDA approval, and I got an email from a 14-year-old girl in India saying how the pump really had made diabetes not be a very important part of her life. So that was extremely rewarding. And sometimes I think designing for everybody doesn't mean reducing effort or eliminating effort. Sometimes it means calibrating effort. So this is a chair that we did for Herman Miller for healthcare. And it's a chair that's designed for patient rooms. And we realized it was that the function of a chair in a patient room is not just for people to sit in and maybe sleep in, but it's to facilitate them getting in and out of the chair as easily and as frequently as possible, but also with some effort. Because that ability to regain mobility after you've had an operation or any kind of a medical procedure is extremely important. So the chair seat is slightly higher when you approach it. You have room to put your feet behind your knees, which gives you mechanical advantage, because we want people to use their own muscle power at that point. The arms are forward so you can feel where they are, and you can sit down, because we also wanted to not make necessary calling a nurse to guide you into the chair. And then when you sit down and you release a lever in the arms, the armrest, which prior to that was actually up, leaning forward to greet you, to let you know that you're in the right position, would guide you into a semi-reclined position where you could very comfortably sleep. But when you wanted to get up, it would put a little bit of pressure moving forward. The seat would rise a little bit and would help you to get up. But I think there's also another dimension of accessibility, which is economic accessibility, right? So we tend to think about solutions that are wonderful solutions, but they require a tremendous amount of financial capital to access. And this wheelchair that you see on the lower image was actually designed by a postgraduate student at MIT to help people, like you see in the left picture, in developing world, in areas that are very difficult to traverse if you're in a wheelchair. And the whole idea of the wheelchair is it uses bicycle components that are very inexpensive. It eliminates the derailleur, which is the most expensive part of a bicycle. And it uses these levers so that if you put your hands up high on the lever, you can exert a lot of force. Down low, you get a lot of speed. So that a local artisan can weld the frame, apply the bicycle components, and you have a wheelchair that would allow someone to actually get to work. The only problem is that this wheelchair costs about $200. And for many people, $200 is a year's income. So we designed the wheelchair at the top, which is exactly the same principle, but it really leverages the leverage of the arms to create an off-road wheelchair that outperforms almost any other wheelchair that's out there, potentially for a fraction of the cost, but it's priced competitively with the idea that the sale of each one of those would pay for 3 of the ones below, right? Again, to provide accessibility to more people that would not have the financial wherewithal to have it. And sometimes we also, I think, need to design things that will change constantly because new abilities and new disabilities are happening all the time. This is a small example of that, but this is another project for Herman Miller, which is it's a Compass patient room, an exam room. And it's all based on components that can be mounted to a wall and can be repositioned and adjusted as new technology presents itself or different levels of acuity in a community presents themselves. I think the same notion in the design of a home can also have a great deal of merit. And I think there are many realities. One thing that I'm thinking a lot about these days is intellectual disability. And the interesting thing about intellectual disability is that it's not just about people who have a very, very low IQ. But if we look at manufacturing jobs, they often require skill sets that require being able to program a computer, for example. So if half of the population in the world has an IQ of 100 or below, they're going to have a very hard time finding gainful employment. How can we make an environment, a society, workplaces that engage people productively, give them the kind of dignity that they want to be able to work productively and navigate a community productively? Even though they may have an IQ of 90, 95, 80, 85. That's part of the spectrum of disability. So thank you.
Thank you. Hello. So I took the universal design in the future part to heart, but in order to do that, I'm just going to go back a little bit first. I was very lucky to start my career working on the then small team with Smart Design that designed the original line of products for a now well-known company called OXO. It was a formative experience for me and the team. What we learned and then acted upon was that by looking at the outer edges of ability, we can make a much better experience for everyone in the middle, which is sort of another way of looking at universal design. If you're familiar with the products, it's now a very extensive line of products in the market, and some of the prototypes from that original line are available for view also here in the museum. So that's what I took with me when I, many years later, launched with 2 other women a company that set out to change the way we think and feel about disability and aging through design, nothing less. And we did that by launching with a cane. A cane is obvious because no one wants one, yet it's a very useful object for many people who use one and need it, and a fabulous item for a number of people who could use it but would not, for all the reasons that we've discussed earlier. So that was our mission. We made a design deliberately based on modes of transportation and feelings that we knew we all had positive feelings about, namely using the bicycle as a material, and a skateboard and a hiking boot, and put them back together in the cane so that the feeling and the joy of movement would still be there in an object, although a person has a very different view of the world when walking with a cane. And on the other side, you see an Amhu cane power user. I don't know this woman. It's a photograph from the streets of New York, and you can see what happens when you actually enjoy using an object for moving around. It's a very safe, comfortable product, but it's also, in this case, a personal accessory, and it's something that people still write to me and say to me, I could not get my mom to use a cane, or I didn't want one when I was recovering. But if I could have one of those ones and the nice turquoise one, then I would do it. And design has that ability to change how we think and feel about a certain situation in life, or about a whole category of products. And this one, durable medical equipment, is one where there's lots of opportunity, and that was exciting to work in. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about the opportunities of what universal design can mean in the future, as we're entering a time when we can customize equipment, things that are close to the bodies. We can 3D print them, we can scan, we can make better fits, and we can design for the one. But I think that the area of shared spaces and public space is still an enormous opportunity. And this is a project that I didn't have anything to do with at all, but I thought you would enjoy seeing it. It is the world's most accessible office building, is what they call it. It is the headquarters of the Association of People with Disabilities, and it's in Copenhagen. It's about 2 years old. I got a fabulous tour from the director of that association. She's in an electric wheelchair with very limited mobility. And she's able to get anywhere in that building by herself without any help. So you can see, just by paying attention to acoustics, creating open spaces where you can have intimate conversations, providing guidance, using color as coding that's very bright, both on the floor and on the walls around. You can make it really easy for people to move around. The indication that you reach floor is included into the handrail, and you can get the elevator by using your foot and not your hands, which seems very obvious, right? It's actually kind of handy if you have your arms full as well. And as the day progressed in that building, I started doing the same thing. If you use your foot, the elevator knows to go local, because it knows that you can't obviously push the button when you go on the inside. So things like that, we keep seeing them. They seem obvious when they're all put together, when a group of people work together on requirements that actually fulfill the needs of, in this case, a very large group of people with various kinds of disabilities. Then you see results that are beneficial and really super pleasant to use for everyone else. Okay, fast forward to, I followed Quirky for a number of years. I'm very interested in how the process of design can evolve, and I joined them recently, and I'm working with them now. So Quirky is a community-powered invention company, or platform, if you will. You can submit an idea for an invention, for a new product. Most of the ideas that we get are based on real-life problems that people have. We vote as a community. We have over 1 million members every week on Thursday night, actually. And if a product is voted in, then Quirky, the company, will work with the inventor to design, develop, produce, and market this product. So it changes how designers and users can work together, and I find that fascinating. So an inventor will have access to a community of potential like-minded people or users that can give feedback along the process, and they have access to design and engineering resources. And we, on the inside, have access to a community of people that we can work with in real time on the designs that we're developing. So this notion of designing for versus with really comes to life in this setting. And it's pretty exciting. It also means that invention can happen anywhere. This is one of our inventors. Her name is Maria. She has 4 kids under the age of 6 and was shopping for wireless speakers, didn't find anything she liked, submitted an idea to us, and became an inventor with a product on the market. This is her product. And these are the lotters. One of the things that happened at Quirky was that the ratio of concepts, ideas for smart products, app-enabled products, to, let's say, home and gardening products really changed in the past couple of years. So in response to that, Wink, a company, was established so that all the inventions, all the products that people make that are app-enabled can play together. Wink is an app and a platform that allows your Nest, GE, and other products to work together seamlessly. So that's another role, I think, of access to design. It's kind of like the universal kit that's shown upstairs. Is like Wink is this part that allows all these different types of inventions to work together. And that's another role for designers and people who are interested in accessibility to really focus on, is to make systems, paths, and environments that are usable for people. Imagine that in healthcare. That would be amazing, right? So the
Beach,
mission
Florida.
is to make home automation accessible to as many people as possible. And in doing that, we've made a series of small movies with people who you may not expect are in the forefront of home automation. And here are the lotters.
We have Wink and we love it.
And we're the beginning of something.
Wink thermal, easy to read. He turns it up to make it warmer. I turn it down when he's not looking. I love the sprinkler system. It goes on automatically, or you work it with the iPhone. That's wonderful, because we could be sitting and watching television. Forgot to turn out the lights. They won't yell at me.
Bing, 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 bing. We want the 43 years to be 44 years.
I know.
Keep your hands on my thermostat. I'll do all the adjusting with Wink. I'm Irving,
I'm Maxine. We're the Lotters.
and we live in Delray Beach, Florida.
We
Hi, so my area of interest is in those in-betweener parts of design where you can't really detect if a product is mass-produced or custom-made, if it's craft, if it's fine art, just where it falls. If it starts defying the silos and defying the categorization, I think that's where things really start to get interesting with design. And I think especially this holds true when you're talking about a medical product, because these are the ones that we interact with when we are at our most vulnerable, when we actually have to use something because we don't want to, we don't have a choice, and we would love it if that product actually respected us in return. Also, the bar is very low there because it's traditionally been designed by medical personnel without regard for design or fashion or the human beyond a most utilitarian perspective very often. And so they're also very limited by the means of creation, in this case, the traditional fiberglass wrap for external stabilization. All of a sudden, you change up some of the tools that you can use to fabricate these, and you change everything. So for example, when you throw in 3D scanning, fairly new, but now made very convenient, and haptic manipulation, it's a tool that traditionally was beyond the realm of most people. Now it's very easy. All of a sudden, the cast can look like a very different thing. In this case, Anais here refused to give us the cast back long after she'd been healed because she kind of fell in love with it. We actually made her two so that she could put one in the dishwasher every night and wake to a somewhat hygienic, clean, warm, fresh cast. That doesn't happen in fracture stabilization. She had a broken arm. Or these two girls who both broke their tibias falling down the stairs. They played in the sand every day and they took a bath and the sand evacuated. You can't do that with a fiberglass cast where the first rule is it can never get wet. So all of a sudden this changes up the rules and the quality of life for everybody. I was hit about October with the diagnosis that I had a torn TFCC ligament in my wrist. This would have been a real pain otherwise, except we did what any self-respecting nerd would do, which is you 3D scan my arm, design the parts based on not getting in the way of circulation or muscles or bony prominences, design it, modify it a few times, and then 3D print the brace. And we can probably safely say that this is the best brace that any human has ever received for postoperative stabilization. I'm able to, the first thing I did when I came out of surgery was I took a shower. You can't do that with a normal brace. I go in for regular acupuncture. I apply heat and cold directly to the surgical site. I have a quality of life that has never been given to somebody going through postoperative surgery recovery. Same applies to carpal tunnel, a major problem with the data world. Most people think that if you buy the brace, you will be healed, and that's actually not, in fact, true. You actually have to wear the brace, and that's what people don't do. They don't wear it because it's an awful, miserable experience. The human being was never considered in the process. But what happens if you 3D scan the arm, design it, let the person choose the type of brace and the fenestration pattern that best suits their fashion sense and their lifestyle, and 3D print something that is tactily transparent to them, that's invisible to their lifestyle and comfortable. They will wear it more. If they will wear it more, they will be healed. And now you scale that up to scoliosis, which is especially difficult because the means of production and this mentality that is devoid of fashion and that human, the squishy human component leads to this. This is state of the art. This is the best money can buy in scoliosis treatment today. The entire treatment hinges on the idea that you can get an 8-year-old girl to do something she's absolutely determined not to do, which is to wear this horrible thing. What could possibly go wrong? So what we did instead was to attack the real problem, which is the desirability of the product. We made it something that was invisible under clothing so we could afford her some discretion. We made it 40% open area so her skin would breathe, so that she would have her creature comforts during recovery. But most importantly, we let her choose from a library of patterns. That turned it into a fashion item that she chose instead of a medical object that was imposed upon her. That little switch meant that she was going to wear the brace more. If she wears it more, she will be healed. That's the way this compliance-based medicine works. We actually debuted these in Paris a few months ago at the Louvre, and we had some interest in the medicine value of scoliosis treatment, but we had far, far more interest in the fashion. And we had many requests for people asking for if we could make them corsets and bodices this way. We haven't gone down that path. We're just not set up to. Or the next generation that we're working on here, which is fully dynamic, which allows the body full range of motion during treatment. We haven't proven this out yet, but if we can, it means that scoliosis treatment will be a slight inconvenience, but not the kind of miserable condition that it currently is. My main focus has, for many years, been on prosthetic limbs, in the sense that it's this odd hybrid of a collection of assembled mass-produced metal products and this carbon and fiberglass socket, which is very ill juxtaposed against the grace and the beauty of the human form. It's a prosthetic device, but there are prosthetic devices around us all the time. We just don't see them that way because they were designed and not simply engineered. So when you start thinking about this approach and you can 3D scan the person and capture their unique form, their uniqueness, their sense of flow of their body, what their shape is, their contours, their lifestyle, you can start creating something that really captures a lot more about them and represents who they are as a person. What is their lifestyle? How they outwardly project themselves, how they describe themselves. It becomes something that is much more a part of their life than simply something that keeps them from falling over. This woman asked if we could do chrome fishnet stockings. And we did. She's an actress in Hollywood. Now she buys her clothes to match her leg. A Boston bombing victim was asking if we could do something that was akin to jewelry. That's exactly what we're hoping to do. We're hoping to start blurring those distinctions between what is a medical product and what is something that has more of the connotation of fashion and beauty, and that really augments the body and accentuates it, really showcases it as a thing, really celebrates the condition instead of either trying to hide it or disguise it or treat it as anything else. Now, in developing countries, it's especially a big challenge because access to medicine is really the gating factor. So what we're hoping to do is one day transform this into something that is entirely designed by script and by algorithm, where the doctor is removed from the equation because that doctor will not exist in much of the world where they're most needed. We can create this by 3D scanning. We all have a 3D scanner in our pocket now. It's a smartphone. Running the script up into the cloud where it gets parsed and created, a three-dimensional leg can be printed, and something that is not only body symmetric, so it starts to reduce the stigma, it also is something that looks beautiful. And the is, again, to reduce some of the social stigma that is sometimes as debilitating as anything else for people who have lost limbs in much of the world. The leg can be fully functional, if not more functional than your typical leg. And the dividend here is that you can take advantage of all of the different opportunities available now, which is that you can create an application which scales as rapidly around the world as a video game with very, very minimal upfront equipment because your smartphone becomes essentially your hospital in your pocket. And the 3D printing allows the kind of versatility that lets you create something that's otherwise very custom, very complex, very nuanced, but the 3D printer doesn't care. It simply prints any data that comes its way. So you can create a very sophisticated, otherwise price-prohibitive leg for and significantly less cost than the traditional leg might be. Now, this is still in development. It has years to go, but I see this as ultimately the way we will see prosthetic limbs in the future through much of the world. And one final project that we've worked on has been with a group called Exobionics, that one day we see that this will be augmented or replaced in many cases for some by this, which is an exoskeletal robot which helps people who are paraplegic or hemiplegic to walk. Right now it's in its nascent stages, but we can see the pathway, and this is fairly clear. Ultimately, Amanda here, who is paraplegic from the L6 down, she was asking us, well, could we end up with something that was more like this? Something that was an intelligent, active robotic fabric. And that itself is not too far-fetched of an idea, because you could actually create a cellular matrix of distributed power, essentially swarming robots that become her secondary skin and power her through walking. Short of that, which we can't do immediately, we were able to begin with a 3D scan of her body, and that essentially then co-created her into the equation. We captured her standing and sitting, and then the idea was to really downplay the military component of that robot. Half of that company is military, half is civilian, and really accentuate the fluidity and the flow of her lines and how that robot works. We actually added 3D printed sterling silver, has a little bit of robot bling. And we really wanted to capture her form. She's an athlete, and she said she just wants to feel beautiful when she's wearing the robot around town. And so we also tried to give it a suggestion of not only the breathability that it offers, but the musculature that the robot is replacing with hers that's no longer active. This is the final result. A year and a half ago, we debuted it on stage in Budapest in front of the government and a number of other people, absolutely unsure of whether or not it would work or whether she would tumble right there on stage. But she was able to walk, and she fell in love with the new variations of this robot. And we're now looking at how the next generations of this robot may work. Now remember, she's paralyzed from the waist down. She has no sensation from her navel downward. And so when you're talking about the combination and the opportunities offered by combining 3D scanning, haptic manipulation, 3D printing, it's pretty boundless, and we can see that there's a pretty exciting trajectory ahead. And it really doesn't just relate to people like Amanda here. It relates to all of us, because we really have to consider that everyone here is, was, or will be disabled. Thanks.
Is this one on? Okay, yes. So we're going to take questions from the audience now. Simi, and is there someone to, oh, there you go. There's the microphone.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you all for this. I'd like to take just a moment to tell any powers that be here at the Cooper Hewitt that as a wheelchair user, I encountered 3 or 4 obstacles between entering the museum and at this moment, which I would like to share with you, some of them by design and some of them in practice, that I was disappointed to see in this museum. So at some point, maybe we can convey that. Thank you for your presentation, and Amy, thank you so much for centering disability. It is so rarely centered in these conversations. You talked a lot more about architecture and spaces than the other presenters, and one of the things you pointed out is that there is a disconnect between both the process and the focus of the designers of objects and that of architects. I experience a great deal of what I label as aggression from the design of buildings and public spaces, the segregation and the separation of disabled people from the general public. And I wonder if the panelists and you as well might respond to what I see. I mean, your process, you talk about collaboration, and that's fantastic. I don't see that happening in architecture, and I wonder if any of you designers might address what the difference might be between you and what architects do.
Okay, can I answer? So I'm both an architect and a although most of what I do is products, but I think part of the problem is that architecture and the way architecture is planned and developed is usually not really at the human scale. Not really usually at the human scale. It's, historically it was planned in elevation and sections, right? And until it was built, it couldn't be experienced. Now, increasingly with and I'm going to be very critical now, so I hope no one is offended. But with the advent of computer-aided design and the technologies associated with that, you can build almost anything that you can design. That doesn't mean you build good things. It means you build things that are iconic, that may brand a city or a site, but very little attention is paid to the way human experience moving through that space. And I think that's a valid criticism of architecture. And there are many architects, that don't want to do that, but they're often are forced to do that also by the sort of economic realities of developers, right? I think what we try to do as product designers, though, is try to look at how we can create kits of parts that help to facilitate dealing with those points of contact, or develop solutions that allow people to overcome barriers that can't be designed away, right? Such as, I don't know, sand on a beach, right? But I do think that a lot more collaboration needs to happen, not just between industrial designers, interior designers, and architects, but city planners and politicians and people who design legislation, right?
Great. Any other questions? I see.
I'm picking up on your point about legislators and policy, because I think that going across disciplines, okay, let me put it a different way. I'm a parent of a 26-year-old who's always used a wheelchair. And there's an assumption that there's curb cuts. Well, they're not there 90% of the time. And there's also the funding issue, and there's also the design and planning of entitlements and budgets. And what I think happens that's very discouraging is we know there are good products out there. We can't get them. We can't get the budgets and the people in the field that should be making modifications more easily obtained, because insurance policies on durable goods have reduced, and it seems to me harder than ever before to do what you've explained. And that's with a lot of advocacy. And I had wanted to bring attention to the fact that the plans that states are offering, which supposedly are customized and individualized, the design of that plan, I think, has gone back in time and does not reflect inclusion. It's all in the rhetoric, but very difficult to implement. So I just wanted to pick up on that. I did have a specific question on the wheelchair that's in the museum. I was curious about the front wheel and the position of that, because the radius of how that turns takes up a great deal of space. And obviously, for what you've designed it for, it's probably less of an issue. But if a person had a wheelchair similar to that here, getting through a doorway, turning in the space, the bathroom space or whatever, would be very difficult. And I wonder if you've addressed that at all, because the motion of not having, for many people with physical disabilities who can't manipulate the wheels, that's a marvelous advantage. But the long frontal wheel is a problem,
So,
if that makes sense.
yeah, the wheelchair was designed primarily to overcome obstacles in the environment, in general environment. It also does navigate in tight spaces. In fact, the levers come off, and it's quite narrow to allow it to go through fairly narrow spaces, because the objective was to allow people to be able to work in any environment, right? So it does turn in a surprisingly tight way. The wheelchair that we designed, so the higher end wheelchair, was really designed for outdoor use. It's really for people who want to go, out into the wild in difficult terrain.
Okay, we'll take the next two questions together and then open it up to the panel to answer.
I'd like to thank all of you. I think all of your designs are tremendous, and thank you for coming this evening and sharing your products with us. The gentleman in the middle, what's your name? I'm sorry?
Scott Summit.
Scott Summit. I think what you're doing is tremendous. As we had talked about, as Amy had talked about in the beginning, a lot of times stigmatism regarding their disability. And that happens with every generation. People might look at someone in a wheelchair, and that's already fading now, but maybe 10, 20 years ago, you would say, well, you belong in a nursing home or something, because they had a wheelchair. So a lot of times, people would almost wish that their wheelchair would vanish, that they could still be the same person. Obviously, they need to use a wheelchair, but that people wouldn't see that in them. A lot of the products that you've created or that you've shown this evening allow a lot of people to heal without feeling embarrassed because they're injured. So I definitely commend you for what you're doing. Amy, I thank you for explaining about the concept of the ADA and universal design in general and how it helps people. And that's why I wanted to allude to Ms. Semi Linton's question in regards to architecture. When it comes to designing, I don't think we should allow a computer to design for humans. Obviously, it's a human who's controlling the computer to design, similar to all of what you've created. You created your designs with the aid of a computer, and it helped assist you. But I think if we have modern invention currently, such as a beach, if a wheelchair user wants to go to a beach, there are inventions now such as mats or beach wheelchairs that allow people to go across the beach, be with their families. It's about inclusion. So I think when it comes to architectural design, if they follow the basic rules of the ADA, it allows for everyone to use it. So when we're talking about universal design, I think it comes to the designer to kind of think outside the box to say, hey, if this is universally designed, everyone, and we follow the rules that have been set, everyone can use it. Wheelchair users especially because of their mobility impairments. But I think that a lot of times going forward when we have new construction, everyone should follow that universal design guideline because no one would lose. Similar to all of the products that you've created. It's for use for everyone so that everyone can enjoy. And that even comes down to some of the buildings that we go to. And I think we need to raise above the level of, oh, well, it's not that accessible, we couldn't do that. Yeah, you can do that. It's just behind the person who's putting it together to do it. But I definitely want to commend all of you for your designs and your inventions. I hope that you continue to invent more and to help people to be themselves.
Thank you for that. And then we have one more question, and then we'll answer. And then, unfortunately, we have to wrap up also because the interpreters need to leave in a couple of minutes. But thank you all so much for your questions. So one more right here.
Hi. Like the previous people, I want to say this was a really excellent presentation. I didn't know what to expect, but you've covered quite a great area. I do a blog on older women's issues, and that's because I'm having older women's issues myself. Several years ago, I had foot surgery, and I needed a cane, and it was so boring, I went to Staples and I bought polka dots, adhesive polka dots, and put it on my cane. And 2 years ago, I broke my wrist, and then the brace was so boring that I bought a sock with Marilyn Monroe on it, and I cut off the end, and I put that over the brace so that I could enjoy looking at it. So all of this really resonates with me, and I appreciate what you're doing. I have one further issue, which is scoliosis. I was diagnosed as a kid, but I didn't have it treated, so I still have it today. And most of my life, it hasn't really been an issue, but as you get older, you lose your bone density, and you start to get dowager's hump, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm thinking, the reason I came here tonight actually was because of Scott Summit's design for the young people with scoliosis. I understand that braces don't work for people of my age, but I just want to put in everybody's ear. I don't know if anything is being done in this area, but I don't know. Could I be a guinea pig? Could I be a consultant? If anybody plans on doing anything about this?
I can answer that. We actually don't have an age limit one way or another. For corrective idiopathic scoliosis, it really is only effective during the pubescent period of skeletal maturity. But for an overall comfort or to combat lordosis, that can be done at any age to improve comfort, and we have been working with people of all ages for that. So it certainly is not a age-defined treatment.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. And thanks again to Ellen for organizing the panel. And we'll all be here if folks want to talk to us individually, I think. So thanks for coming. Bye.